We're halfway through the season now, and your races have not gone the way that you wanted them to go. I think it's quite a common place to be in round about end of June, start of July, and the automatic instinct for most athletes is I need to change something. I need to do something. I need to drastically change everything that I've done. Everything that I've done has been an absolute failure. How do I gather the season to make the best of the back half? Um, and we're just going to chat a little bit about what that decision process should look like, why it's not maybe always, the end of the world, and kind of which direction to take things. So, Phil, how's the start of your season went? Maybe we'll start there.
Oh, there's a lot I can add to this. So interesting. I will just say one thing, and this is July from a total try point of view is, June actually. We look at the figures in July, and it's one of the biggest intake months of new athletes to the business. So I can only assume one of the drivers here is people have been, I don't know, following a plan they've downloaded on the internet or doing their own training, and they've probably done a few races and gone, that's not gone so well. I need some professional help here. And I think if you ask me how the natural flow of athlete intake would be, you would think that this would be a very settled part of the year. Whereas actually, I see it as, people have been to some races, maybe looked at how other people are performing, wondering how they've got there, looking at their mistakes, and even athletes looking for just accountability. I need someone to keep me on track. We certainly see that in people approaching us looking for a coach. So, yeah, and then, I mean, this is quite a close to home subject, and we actually haven't even spoken about this off air, but this has definitely been a week for me of big reflection, actually. And not that I'd say the start of my season went too badly, but I'm reassessing, I guess, life balance and how I'm fitting my training in, what I wanted to achieve in the next part of the year, how that's going to fit. And maybe we'll come on to that later. And I, made some fairly big decisions as to what I'm going to do from a racing point of view for the rest of the year, or what I'm not going to do from a racing point of view for the rest of the year. And I think maybe it is just you get to that middle of the season, and you've got enough information to start to make some decisions on what's next. So and then just finally, thinking about athletes, and of course, you've got a lot of athletes who've had very successful starts for the year, and they're looking forward to build towards bigger things, maybe in championship season. But absolutely, you've got other athletes who it hasn't maybe gone right for: illness, injury, life keeps throwing them lemons. And sometimes, as I'm sure we'll discuss here, the athlete themselves has got to look at how they've been conducting their training and for the outcome that they want. So there's obviously some honest conversations to have with people. Coaches need to reflect very well on what's gone on and what their role in course correcting and a season may look like. So I think that's what we're gonna get into.
Yeah, it's just always worth remembering, the first few races having not gone to plan doesn't always mean that everything has went wrong. And I think the middle of the season, maybe I can't remember if it was the last podcast or podcast before, we were taking that mid-season break, and maybe if that's coming up, it's a brilliant time to have that reflection and actually delve into it a little bit. But what we need to separate, and I think as athletes, we always become very attached to the result, the outcome, and you hear it all over the place, process over outcome, and everybody listens and goes, yeah, that makes sense, and then forgets about it 2 minutes later. But we need to try and separate that results not matching that expectation with, is there actually an underlying problem? Because these two things can go together, but sometimes they don't. For example, a few disappointing races in a season is kind of normal, especially if you're racing semi-regularly. And it doesn't necessarily mean that anything is wrong. It just sometimes means that you were dealt a little bit of a bad hand on race day. And, if we do react to every little negative outcome, then we run the risk of changing things before the thing that you were working on has had the chance to develop. So what do you think a season actually going wrong is, Phil? Like, when do we start to look into it? When should we start asking questions about, when to shift plan or change direction?
Yeah, I think, I mean, look, I had plenty of years myself where I'd have a terrible first 6 months of the year and I'd be putting everything in. I'd be very emotionally attached to the outcome. I really wanted it to go well and it just didn't really come off. And so you'd quite often have to step back and go, okay, I think one of the key things to understand here is the year can absolutely look very different to the first part of the year. You can turn things around, and how you do that, it is different in every case, and it's probably different in different years, even for the same person. But you can go on to actually have one of your most successful seasons. And I've always said to athletes, and you just made the point there, actually, Grant, of having one or two bad races within the course of a season is probably normal. If they happen to be those first few races, then you start to get into this negative headset, don't you? Of "Oh, I'm no good, I'm not achieving expectation." And actually, I think for me, that's the way it went an awful lot. I never really started a season so well. Now, very simply for me, with what I do for a living, is that training camp season, March, April, everyone starts racing in May. I am up the wall with work. I've got a lot of travel on. I'm trying to get fit myself. And invariably, it showed in racing. I was a bit fatigued. I wasn't as fit as I thought I was. And suddenly get into the summer holidays and, athletes are busy doing their own things with families, things go a little quieter. And guess what? You race really well through September and October because work's been a little quieter. We as a business always actually discuss, through August, just lowering the workload a little bit whilst, that if you look at the Ironman calendar as an example, there's not that many races in August, that even they acknowledge it's kids' holidays and things go a little quieter. So yeah, having a look at what's going on externally in your life, and for some reason, I knew this, and I would still see the race in May I wanted to do well in, and I still do that now. I like to race Tracker, which is the most godforsakenly hard race there is, and it's in May every year, and I can't resist entering it, and it's probably not a smart thing because I'm going on training camps, and what they're like to run. You have to give your all, and you've got everything going on at home, and you're just exhausted. So I think that's a big thing to acknowledge what's going on around training and how that aligns for you. I think also having a little bit of a reflection as a coach and as an athlete into how well training was really conducted, how much of the training maybe got missed due to external circumstances or fatigue or illness, and just being honest about that. If you lose 2 weeks to having a cold, you've effectively, by the time you've lost the 2 weeks and spent 2 weeks coming back up, you've lost a month of progress. That's just a very simple way to look at that. Winter full of colds, people being ill. So I think there's a lot of reasons why that first half of the year is trickier. And I think people at that point, if they can look back and go, well, there was all of these roadblocks in the way and this didn't go right and that didn't go right and maybe work's being busy or, family life, etc. I think that's the point where, one of the things we're here to talk about is, push or pivot. Do you push on down the same path or do you pivot in another direction? And actually, if you can see a path ahead where things are going to change and life's easier, work stress is lower, time of year is better, then I actually think you were probably in a period where maybe due to various factors, adaptation from training wasn't coming through, even though you were doing the training. And that's not to say the training is lost as well. There's a key point there. You still did the work. The work's in the body. You just, you probably just haven't had the adaptation in that period. I actually read a study on this the other week, actually, about athletes adapting. I'm going off on a tangent here, not adapting and then adapting in the next block, if you like, based off external factors. And it was quite interesting. And I think what the study was trying to conclude was that if you didn't do the first block at all, because external factors were stopping you adapting, you would be in a worse state than if you just waited till everything was perfect to get on with your training. Sometimes standing still is progress. And that first part of the year where you might not have got the lifting performance you wanted, it doesn't mean it was wasted. It just means you've navigated a period and you've probably just remained, at least physiologically, in a solid place to build in the second part of the year. So, yeah, I've waffled on for a little bit there. What's your take on anything I've just said?
I think you're 100% spot on, and there's always going to be a variety of reasons, right? And some of them are going to be in your control. Some of them are going to be out with your control. And so I think before you kind of before you push through or you pivot, I think it's worthwhile in that kind of reflection process to start to, well, understand what was it that went wrong and which type of mistake was that. And I think we can kind of split it into three different buckets, three different things. I think give you your kind of obvious out of your control ones that are, kick you in the face. And that might be, for example, as you said, Phil, having a cold for a couple of weeks. That's an obvious thing. It might be actually just a rotten few races of bad luck where you had mechanicals, you had a puncture, I don't know, somebody stole your running shoes, whatever. You can't really do anything about. You just kind of have to suck it up and wait it out, and wait for the sun to start shining again. And racing is,
Sorry, while you're on this first bucket idea of what's out of your control, which is generally a lot of the stuff I was just talking about there. I think what athletes need to understand, we're both long in the tooth with all this stuff. We've been around a long time. We've seen that, and I just tried to explain that this was a common theme for me in the first half of the year, yet you go on to success. It's really hard for athletes to see that about themselves when maybe they've not got as much experience. They just go, I'm not performing the way I want. Surely I need a change of direction. And what we're saying with this bucket here is that's not the route here. The route here is definitely to stay the course.
Yeah, 100%. And listen, it's difficult. And there's always a fine balance when you come up to a race where, as an athlete, your job is to convince yourself that you're the fittest person in the world, right? You got to have confidence oozing out of yourself. And that's not the time to be realistic. It's not the time to think about the colds you've had, think about the busy work life, all that kind of stuff. So in some ways, it makes it harder to be realistic with yourself after the race. However, I always think it's worth having that reflection so that you can, put those things a little bit more into perspective. But you're right, Phil. It is a really hard thing to kind of rationalize when, after a race, if it's not went well, you're just upset, right? You're just angry.
Yeah, I think just thinking of some examples of, athletes I work with who've sort of not had this great start to the year. And we, of course, have conversations, and illness, injury, life stress, other things going on that's stopping them getting enough training done, of course, leads to that. I think it's quite hard as a coach to, you have to have honest conversations and nearly try to understand or to help the athlete get some of those external factors out the way for the second half of the year if they want success. If those, and this is an important point, if those external factors are not going to shift out the way, whether that's work, stress, you're about to have your first child, whatever it is, then I think that's then when you might look to pivot. And the pivot is possibly resetting expectation, lowering pressure on the outcomes, understanding that actually, and I definitely have this conversation with athletes a lot, I was just talking about standing still sometimes is nearly success for when things settle down. It could be that the whole year is a year of standing, because if you drop away now, the rebuild to next year is very difficult. And then it could be that you strip a few races out the calendar, take the pressure off, getting results, but you still get the process of training in. And that's actually something that's the path I've decided to take for the second half of the year is I'm just going to take the pressure off and potentially not race the second half of the year. It absolutely, me and you have just had a conversation off air about what training looks like this week. I was still out doing a double day's training on the bike yesterday. It won't change that. It's just, I feel around where life is for me at the moment, expecting the results I want. It's just not realistic. So I decided to just take a bit of pressure off. I have actually got a few race entries. If I feel good in a couple of months, maybe I'll show up on race day. But for now, I'm just taking the pressure off and enjoying in the process of training. And that's definitely a point at which I've pivoted, if you like, rather than pushed on.
I think that's a smart way to do it for sure. At the end of the day, we're all doing this for a positive experience out of it, and there's no point in grinding yourself into the ground needlessly. I think that, which brings us on to that second bucket. I think when and this is maybe more around race days, when something happens, maybe it's a tactical error, maybe it's a nutritional error, but it's an easy fix, right? It doesn't necessarily need a whole revamp of anything. It probably just requires a conversation and a little bit better planning and execution for your next race. And some of these things can completely, derail your race through seemingly silly little things. Like I remember, I always used to do a race at the start of the season as a complete throwaway race, knowing that I didn't care about it, I didn't care about the result, the performance, but I just wanted to do it so that I could make all of these mistakes, so that I could, all those things that I hadn't thought of in the past 6 months when I was just winter training. I would go and do the race and make the mistakes so that I could recognize them and put them right. But I think for a lot of us, maybe if we've not raced a lot recently or ever, then sometimes it is just about making those mistakes, learning from them, and then quickly moving on and doing the right thing the next time.
Yeah, I think the first one that springs to mind there is people overbiking. Quite a common thing. Why did my race not go well? Fell apart on the run. I mustn't be fit enough. It must be my running that's bad. It must be, and actually just getting people to maybe use the next race as the course correction. But you don't change the training, keep the training the same. Actually, try something different on the. This is something as well. I think maybe people are entering these big races, and it's got to go a certain way. And I really think people should be racing more local races more frequently, using them as training sessions, using them as pacing experience. Gaining more and more experience in the sport, confidence in themselves, knowing how to execute, patience. Throwaway races, I thought was a great phrase you just used there. There's nothing wrong with having a couple of them through the year just to see where you're at, try something new. And that's definitely a moment where, if you're looking at a race and the execution, and I had a really good athlete actually did Ironman Austria a few weeks ago, and he was in a great position. He just took the run out too hard at the start. Just, he's actually a brilliant runner. And he's a 70.3 racer really. And I think he thought he was in an Olympic distance, not an Ironman. And he threw the result away. And, all we've done is enter another Ironman, you know, 6 months away. He'll go to Oman in December, and we'll execute differently. And the training was there, the performance was there, and I think it's just about nearly parking all of that because the disappointment's so big. It's hard to see past. There must be more than one thing going wrong. And actually, if you can see something in the data, in fact, I didn't even need the data. I was following him on the Ironman tracker, and I was watching the first 5K, thinking, I know what's going on here. So and he does listen to this podcast, so I'm sure he'll love me mentioning that. But yeah, that's definitely another good way to look at what's gone wrong at the first part of the year. So that's two buckets. There must be a third bucket.
Well, I think this is the one that everybody automatically jumps to, right? And I think it's probably the least common one, certainly from my experience. And this is when you realize that you're going down a route and you realize that there's something fundamental that you need to change. One that's certainly cropped up for me with a few athletes over the past number of years that I think is quite common is you do a spring marathon, right? You've got a spring marathon cards, so the first half of the year, the first few months is all focused on getting marathon ready, marathon fit. And then the fallout of that, maybe you've got a block of 70.3 races kind of mid to late season. And there's a point round about now, that you realise that you've still got your marathon legs on and you've not necessarily got the pace again. And something like that actually needs a bit of a dedicated block to change a little bit of the physiology, change a little bit of perhaps a little bit of a rut that you're in, and requires more of a change in plan, more of a proper pivot. What do you think? So sometimes I think that's quite hard to recognise. And as you say, like most people, they do a race and they think that there's all this stuff going on. They think it's maybe multifactorial. They think it's something that's going to take a long time to fix and address. Whereas, as you were just talking about, sometimes it's just a tactical error, sometimes it's just a change. How do you think we can kind of tease that out? Sometimes it's obvious, as you were just saying, you watch your athlete on the tracker and you've seen the first 5K, you've seen the splits, like he can't hold that. But where is the difference? How can we start to tell that?
I think there's a few things here. Look, I think a fairly experienced coach would look at the athlete saying, I struggle with the cold water in the swim, and I didn't feel I could hold X amount of power on the bike, and I didn't feel like I had any speed on the run, or whatever it is they're coming to you after the race. And normally it's not one thing; it's like they've got these several things held me back, and then I think you have to look at, first of all, look back. How was the build? Honestly, actually, when someone says I didn't have the speed on the run, well, quite often it's nothing to do with how much speed you've got. It's probably, you know, the build wasn't perfect, the athlete wasn't fit enough, they've come off the bike, they're already well depleted in glycogen. Of course, you're not going to run quick. You effectively weren't fit enough because their expectation of what they've done in the past, for example, might be set here, quite high, and then the build hasn't been right, the fitness isn't right. Maybe they're burning through more carbohydrate on the bike than they have on previous races, and the run goes south, and they're blaming it on the running. So I think you've got to look at the whole situation to decide what it is that's caused. Because if you're going to give someone a dedicated block to work on something, I think you've got to justify that they actually need that, because it could be, if, the run's gone badly, it's actually, a big bike block that's needed, for example. I think that marathon example you used is quite good, but you also, how big was the taper? How long was the recovery? When you come back to training, have you lost speed or have you just lost fitness? Would general training put you back on the right track? And then I think there's even like a psychological component to it, where sometimes athletes need confidence, and giving them a little bit of that for a few weeks in a certain area to just, know that they've done the work to correct an area that felt a little bit weak on race day, but never really, I think people talk about specific blocks, and I still think it's, if you lean in a certain direction, you don't come off the general plan and the general principles of training. A lot of, I think what we're talking about here, a lot of what has gone wrong is so multifactorial. You've got to look through it all to see what's real, I guess, and then course correct.
Yeah, there's something you mentioned there that I thought was quite interesting. And, maybe it's something like, that kind of cold water example, that you felt a little bit chilly in the water, and you think that's what caused your swim performance to not be as you wanted, or start the bike or whatever. And maybe it was that, maybe it wasn't. But actually, just by sprinkling a few colder open water sessions into the program for the next kind of few weeks, maybe it'll change a little bit of your physiology, but it might just change the mind, right? It might just give you that extra confidence to say, the next time you're open water swimming, you're cold water swimming in a race, actually you've got it, because you've just done it several times. You've desensitized yourself to it a little bit. So sometimes when, the answer is push through, maybe we just need a little bit of a sprinkling of something new to freshen things up. Equally, with running, like, maybe it is just adding in a few strides during the week so that you kind of get that mechanical turnover back. You start to feel good, you start to feel a little bit more fluid, and the confidence comes and things starts ticking into line. Meanwhile, you're progressing, you're training, you're pushing through, you're continuing with what works. Because I think that's a big thing, right? Now, I know we kind of speak about it all the time, get 70.3 fit, you're ready for everything. And truth be told, triathlon training is pretty damn simple. You swim, you bike, you run. You provide a stimulus, you adapt to it. And whilst, I know Phil and I kind of like getting into the nitty gritty and the weeds of it all, because we spend far too much time in the sport. But for the majority of us, you're getting 95% of the way there just by doing the thing, just by training, just by turning up. And so we never need to throw everything out is probably a good place to come to at the end of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that example of strides in the workout, I think, is a great one, because when you're writing a plan for someone, yeah, there are, like you said, endurance sport is relatively simple. There are things athletes need to do. But when you write a plan for someone, you're listening to what they've told you recently or conversations you've had with them, whether you're adding strides from a psychological point of view or a physiological point of view, or any other little nuance to their training that will help get them to a better place, engage them in their training better. And I go back to what I said right at the start of this podcast, which aligns with you talking about how simple this is. Sometimes a lot of poorer performances come from external factors, under recovery, because of whatever reason, lack of adaptation to training, mistraining. And, I work with an athlete at the moment, and he quite often goes, yeah, I'll leave you to it with your magic sauce. And I think he's referred like, some magic training principle I've got, and there's no such thing. What you can do is just put the right thing in for the right person for the right reason. There's no wildly, of course, different physiologies require sessions to be conducted in different ways. And, of course, there's different ways of training people. And, some stuff works for one, doesn't work for another. We know all that, but they aren't wild differences. Quite often, I think what we're talking about today is when things haven't gone swimmingly in the first half of the year, excuse the pun there, the answers often lie in external factors, and maybe, race day execution is probably another big one. And like you said, I think the third bucket is slightly less common and should be quite easy to overcome by just listening to the athlete well and adding in the correct extras to their training to just work on a specific area to bring that back to where they need it.
Yeah. Like, just to round it off, if you have had a shit first half of the season, if it's not went well, one of the best things you can do is have a conversation. Have a chat with your coach or a friend that's maybe in the sport, somebody that's been around and knows a little bit, and kind of use that as an opportunity to self-check a little bit, take the emotion away from the bad performance and get a little bit of perspective on it, uh, and then make the decision. Is it a sprinkling of something new from maybe a mental point of view, maybe a little bit of physiology? Is it actually, what, that was just sheer bad luck, and I'm just going to keep on showing up, and luck will change, and I'll get some good races in the back half of the season, which it always doesn't. Luck always changes, and realize for yourself what that is. Which bucket are you in? What change do you need to make? Do you need to make a change? And I guarantee you that if you reflect well enough, if you truly understand that reflection, which is a really, really key skill to have, you will always be able to turn it around.
I agree. Having a conversation is what we're here for as coaches. Starting to work through things with people. I think the second half of the year, you can go from one extreme to another. You could take the pressure off racing by changing expectation, changing your view on what you're trying to get out of racing. Or you can go totally the other way. You could race more. You could start to insert races so that actually the pressure comes off. You use races to hone your craft, enjoy the second half of the year, use them to get fit. You can go either way. But I think the final note from me here is accept where you are now is really important. You are where you are fitness wise. You are where you are race result wise. Step back and go, where do I want to be by the back end of the year? And how do I get there? And that goes back to having a conversation to start with, assessing what's going on externally, assessing expectation and assessing your fitness level. I think there's a point where, and this is certainly something that I am doing with my athletes at the moment, just getting up to date on where people are at fitness wise, getting some decent baselines in, doing a bit of testing, making sure everybody understands exactly where they are. If you've had a mid-season break, you've probably lost some fitness. That's fine. It comes back pretty quick. And then just keep moving forward. And, if you've had a poor first half of the year, you're probably not as fit as you wanted to be at this point. I think that's another reason to accept where you are rather. And that's no bad thing. I think if you've had higher performance or higher fitness levels in the past, always thinking that is you at this point of the year just isn't the best way forward. So there could be a physiological reset required at this moment to get the best out of yourself.
It's always salvageable, always salvageable. So do your reflection, have the conversation, make the changes that you need to do, and I guarantee you the second half will be 10 times better than the first.
Absolutely.